start by praying. Father, we thank you for this time and, Lord, for providing for us in spite of the technical difficulties and the ability to have this class. We pray for your blessing on it and that we would learn much from it. We pray it in Jesus' name. Amen. Like I said, we probably won't have a chance to do Q&A, but I may be able to get in all my notes now, so let me get to it. A good illustration to start off this week about atheism, just a little solidarity with our presuppositionalist brothers. I know I've criticized their method, but there's a really good piece of imagery that comes from Van Til. He once used the picture of a child on his grandfather's lap, and this is not a good child. He's pulling at the beard of his grandfather in defiance. He's hitting and insulting his grandfather. And his grandfather has more than enough strength and ability to cast the child off and put an end to this whole impertinent display. But being a loving and patient grandfather, he doesn't do that. So the child is oblivious in the midst of his tantrum that he's carrying on like this only because of the good graces of his grandfather. Now, in this imagery, the child represents the atheist, and the grandfather represents God. And the idea here is that the atheist is borrowing from God. He couldn't do any of the things he's doing without being elevated, without depending on the grandfather. What we want to do here is fill that out and say, okay, how is that the case? So let's get a definition first of atheism. We've done that for theism, different forms of theism. We've done it for agnosticism. So let's do the same for atheism. This one comes from Corduan. I've mentioned his book a couple of times. And he just defines atheism as the denial of any God whatsoever. So according to the atheist, there's no supreme being. The world is all that there is. And he goes on to say that atheism suffers from three serious problems. It is unprovable, it is contrary to human nature, and it lives on borrowed capital. I think that approach has a lot to be commended to it. I'm going to have a similar approach, but not exactly. Here's my outline. This is the big section that'll take us most of the time, logic and atheism, because the whole subtitle was the incoherence of atheism. We're going to show how that argument is sitting on grandfather's lap in a very tangible way. Two very short sections just to show how atheism is basically a circular kind of reasoning, the way that it's carried on, and then also how it is a religious commitment. And these are obviously not things the atheist wants to hear, and they have a particular way they try to get around it. And then if we have time, and I'm going to try to, there's the more modern forms that this argument takes, and I'll explain that distinction when we get there. So let's just get to it. First, the incoherence of atheism, how it handles the logic round, why it's not getting out of the logic round. The atheist, in order to make a logical case, he can't be content to show that God probably doesn't exist. He wants to do more than that. Nor is he content to say that the theist hasn't made his own point. He wants to do more than that. For atheism to be demonstrated as true, logically, the logical argument for atheism, the position has to show how God cannot exist, that it would be unintelligible for him to exist. In other words, they want to show something like the square circle or the married bachelor about God. And for that reason, sometimes it's called logical atheology. That's kind of a weird way to put it. But if you think of the word agnosticism, same thing's happening here with the word itself. It's a negation of theism, but here it's a logical negation of theism. So Corduan points out one of the most obvious problems with it. It's one that maybe you've thought about, and that is that it is virtually impossible to prove a negative. And he's more talking about this line of reasoning here, impossible to prove a negative. Why? Well, remember I introduced these words, induction and deduction. There's two basic ways you could approach this if you're an atheist, and both have problems. You could show all the different things in reality and say, nope, no God here. Well, I looked into space, nope, no God there. And there's a couple of problems with that. one of them is just that you would have to possess exhaustive knowledge or establish that you have conducted an exhaustive search. And that's the problem with induction in general. It's not really a problem with it. It's just if you try to use it to show something is universally not the case, you can't do it unless you're omniscient, which would kind of be anticlimactic for an atheist who's trying to disprove that there is such a thing as omniscience. So mostly they're going to be up here. I'm talking about intelligent atheists. I'm not talking about the stuff you hear in pop culture. They really are there. Oh, look, we looked in space and there was no God there. Yeah, okay, that's a silly atheist, and there's many of them. But we don't want to straw man them. We want to look at their best arguments against God logically. Here, the deductive approach is saying, again, that it is logically impossible. Now, we have to divide those kind of arguments. The arguments for no God on the basis of logic take two forms. You have either God versus God, a theology, or you have God versus world, a theology. And the problem of evil, by the way, is going to be in that, and we're going to devote a whole week to that. It's almost a special case. But God versus God, a theology, basically says this attribute of God and this attribute of God, and that's why the arrow goes this way, this attribute of God and this attribute of God, or maybe plural attributes of God, don't go together. If this is true, that has to be false. They're incoherent. Or it's incoherent with itself, the very idea of this attribute. In this idea, there's an attribute of God, or several attributes of God, and something about the world that don't go together. Either this is true or this is true. But since one of them is true, the other is false, therefore God can't exist. So these are two different directions or ways of showing that one of God's attributes cannot possibly be true. Okay, so that's the lay of the land here. But here lies the essential difficulty. If this is true, that one or more of God's attributes cannot exist, you're saying that it is necessarily never existed, because something that's impossible to exist also cannot actually exist. You can't have an impossible actual thing. If it's impossible, it's never existed. But what follows from that? If that's true, if attribute A of God, whatever the attribute is, if it can never exist, nothing like it ever has existed. Not physically, not spiritually, not theoretically. And again, it's a square circle. It's a married bachelor. It cannot be conceived. That's one of the things we saw about a square circle. So what follows from that? Well, it follows that whatever form the rest of the argument takes, no matter how much it builds upon itself, the argument is going to proceed. Let me just give you an example. And I'm going to lay out this example on a separate slide. But let's just take omniscience. Omniscience, if that's the attribute we're talking about, either would or could do something. This is usually the form that this takes, or omnipotence, or something like that. Well, if God were good, he would do this. Or infinite love would do this. Or omnipotence is this, or does this, or can't do this, or goodness never does X, whatever it is, and so on and so on and so on. But if the argument makes good on its claims, then the subject term, omniscience, omnipotence, goodness, whatever it is, the subject of any of these propositions is a non-subject and can have no predicates. Again, it's like so if I say, a square circle can't run very fast, or I don't know, just picking something out of the blue. If that thing cannot exist, then you can't attribute anything to it, good or bad or anything else, because the very idea is inconceivable. It's not a possible state of affairs. Even one atheist that I'll mention later, Feuerbach, in the 19th century, and his whole idea was to say that the divine attributes are just these human projections. They're things about ourselves that we just say the superlative degree of that thing, and we call that God. But even he said that to deny all the qualities of a being is equivalent to denying the being himself. A being without qualities is one which cannot become an object to the mind. That's the crucial part. And such a being is virtually non-existent. The last part kind of weakens it all out, but really, he's running into this insight, whether he likes it or not, that if a thing cannot exist, then you can't conceive of it in the mind. Okay? Or to put it another way, nothing could ever be known about a non-thing. Make sense? Not because, well, I'm not aware of that thing now. No, your argument is that the thing is inconceivable. Okay, so let's start to put some flesh on this. And I'm going to, as I said, I'm going to pick omniscience. And this is where you really have to show the argument. The argument that omniscience would or could do something, what it is and is not. If it's going to make good on its claim that omniscience has to exist at least as a coherent concept, at least theoretically, even if it's not an actual entity, it has to make sense. It can't be like the square circle. But if it did not exist precisely because it could never exist, then it, well, there wouldn't be any it, couldn't be anything. It couldn't do anything. At the very least, you would have to say, well, the atheist wouldn't have any information about the thing. Go right back to agnosticism from last week. If I say the finite cannot grasp the infinite, supernature cannot be known, all these different things, God is too big of a concept. Remember, I asked the question to the agnostic, what is it about this bigness? Or what is it about infinity that makes it the kind of thing that cannot be known? So you're saying you can't know a single thing about it. Now, the atheist may not be able to see this as clearly, we may not be able to see this as clearly as we saw those short sentences last week, because here I am laying out a whole argument with 6 premises. God is by definition omniscient. This is the atheist saying, okay, your being here is an omniscient being. He knows all things. Well, an omniscient being would be able to do X, whatever it is. For example, he ought to be able to know what time it is right now. And this is one example that this takes. So either he's omniscient, and he knows, or he's changeable, because if he knows what time it is, then he's inside time. Time changes, therefore God changes. There's a sequence of thoughts, which is where they make their mistake, by the way. They're defining knowledge down to changeability or experiencing it like human beings do and so forth. But leave that aside. On a more basic level, they're saying that an omniscient being, omniscience, would do this or could do this, etc. Premise 3, yet this God cannot do X. According to your own argument, you theists, therefore an omniscient being, God, cannot exist. Therefore, omniscience cannot exist by definition. But I'm going to help them out here. I'm going to say, well, that's something else follows there. You may not state it, but that which cannot exist cannot be or do anything. Wouldn't you agree with that? I think they'd have to. Therefore, an omniscient being would or could do a thing, whatever the thing is you're talking about, and cannot be said to be or do that thing at the same time and in the same relationship. He said, wait, what's that? Well, you're acknowledging that a non-existent thing, that an incoherent thing, which cannot even be a thing, cannot be or do anything. And yet you say that this thing that is your subject term is exactly that, a non-thing, nonsense. So it follows, in your view, that an omniscient being would or could do a thing and cannot be or do that thing at the same time in the same relationship. Is that right? Of course, he's going to try to wiggle out of this. I didn't say that about one or the other. And then you could help him out with your red pen again and say, yes, you did. I got the first one from premise 2. An omniscient being or omniscience would be or do something. It is a thing. It can do a thing. But then later on, you acknowledge that that thing is not a thing and therefore cannot do or be a thing. Now, I realize this is harder than with agnosticism, where you can boil it down to one sentence, where the predicate directly contradicts the subject. With atheism, you've got to draw it out a little bit. And there's examples where you can draw it out even more concisely. But the principle's the same. And the principle you can put like this. Contradictions in terms do not signify possible things. For that same reason, they don't signify actual things. An actual thing has to be a possible thing. Remember, the logic round comes first. A thing has to at least be able to be. But contradiction in terms do not signify possible things. That's going to be important when we get to those clever ones like, God can't make a rock too heavy for himself to lift. Aha! Aha, I see somebody never took logic. That's not a problem, because contradiction in terms do not signify possible things. Here's easy forms to see that with. Consider that God is by definition immortal. Immortality cannot be mortal by definition. Therefore, God dies. What's that? That's just a way to say mortal. Death is a contradiction in terms. It's logically equivalent to saying immortal, mortal. Immortality dies. Same thing with truth. God is by definition truth. God cannot be false by definition. So God lies is a contradiction in terms. Why? Because it is logically equivalent. You're just hiding by saying it in such a way that you don't have to stare at the contradiction. Maybe you're not doing it maliciously, but you're just not understanding that that's what you're doing. It's the same as to say truth lies, or truth is untruth, or truth can behave untruly. Now, the atheist at this point has a predictable objection back to this. You're just defining God that way up front. That's true, I am. But you have an interest in letting me do that. Because if you don't refute this definition of theism, two problems result for you. Number one, you're not dealing with every definition of theism. Suppose you want to say, well, that's only your definition of theism. Fine. Well, then you haven't refuted mine, and there's a lot of onlookers right now, so you have an interest in doing that. That's one thing. But secondly, if you're an honest person at all, and if you've been around and you know theistic literature and you know anything about Christianity at all, you know that this is exactly how Christianity defines God. So whatever kind of God you have refuted, you haven't refuted the Christian idea of God, Christian theism, right? So you have a double. So do you want to refute a straw man? Do you want all these people gathering around to know that you're only content to pick on little kids at the playground and said that you've been a tough-minded atheist? Because that's what you're doing, unless you refute this idea. So I have no problem saying, yes, I am defining God that way up front. Guilty. But you have an interest in refuting exactly that. Well, I'll get to that. But let's just get to this one. God cannot make a rock too heavy for himself to lift. Boom! What do you do with that, theists? Well, the notion that God ought to be able to make a rock too heavy for himself to lift involves two basic errors. First of all, it places upon the Christian theist a burden of defending a notion that we don't mean by God. Again, we are defining him a certain way up front. Power to do all things is what omnipotence means. So in other words, it's a straw man. But secondly, the notion of divine omnipotence that it gives is incoherent in any event, even if we didn't know to define omnipotence as power to do all things. Now, why do I say that? Because this dilemma, again, is equivalent to doing this, except with power. Now you're saying omnipotence lacks a power, right? That's a logical equivalent to what you're saying. Lewis talks about this in his book, The Problem of Pain, and he does it very well. It's a big quote, but it's worth quoting. He says this: his omnipotence, meaning God's omnipotence, means power to do all that is intrinsically possible, not to do the intrinsically impossible. You may attribute miracles to him, but not nonsense. This is no limit to his power. If you choose to say, God can give a creature free will and at the same time withhold free will from it, you've not succeeded in saying anything about God. Meaningless combinations of words do not suddenly acquire meaning simply because we prefix to them the two other words, God can. It remains true that all things are possible with God. The intrinsic impossibilities are not things, but non-entities. You see what he's saying there? He's not saying, well, let's make a special case because it's God. No, he's saying that A equals non-A is nonsense, and simply tacking on the words, God says this, doesn't suddenly, poof, make it make sense, right? So he says, it is no more possible for God than for the weakest of his creatures to carry out both of two mutually exclusive alternatives, not because his power meets an obstacle, but because nonsense remains nonsense even when we talk about God. So in other words, if you say that omnipotence should be able, I'll put it in quotes, to lack a power, that's not an ability. That's an inability. Okay, it's the same as saying that omnipotence should be able to not be able. See, now if you say it like that, that is what they're saying. So in logic, it's very important to convert terms into their logical equivalent. It's not a magic trick or anything like that. They've just concealed the fact that they're talking nonsense to themselves by this clever, well, let's use a rock in our example. And so what happens is by the storytelling and by the sense of superiority that you have over the Christian who hadn't thought of this, you've blinded from yourself the fact that all you're doing is saying A equals non-A. Okay? And that's what Lewis is saying. And that's why he uses that example of free will. Don't let that distract you, his particular example he's using. He's saying God has the power to do all things, and God does not have the power to do all things. And he just, and he wasn't even dealing with the rock example, I don't think. He was just dealing with attacks on omnipotence in general. Another philosopher, Ralph McInerney, says basically the same thing. He says things that are impossible because they make no sense, let me stop him there, are not things. Square circles they're not logically possible things. That's not a lack of power in God. That's you being confused, and I'm holding up a mirror to your confusion. All you've done is tacked on the words, God should be able to take my gobbledygook and make it not gobbledygook. That's not a thing, right? So he says, things that are impossible because they make no sense cannot be caused by God, and this is scarcely a restriction on or a diminution of his omnipotence, that God cannot bring it about that what is true is also false, does not detract from his power. Can God bring it about that the past has not been? That might also be a distracting example, because you might start thinking to yourself, well, if he's outside of time, but that's not McInerney's point. He's just saying the idea that, well, God ought to be able to make A equal non-A is a confusion of categories on your part. So don't project your confusion on God and call that a power, right? That's what it's doing. Okay, here's another objection, really quickly. This is an atheist named Kai Nielsen, and he makes this argument. Premise one, God is supposed to be a non-material spiritual being. He doesn't have a body. 2, God is supposed to be a being who performs certain actions. 3, the only intelligible notion of actions that we have is associated with material or embodied beings. And if you are seizing on that third premise, your suspicions are right. That's where the problem's going to be. 4, the idea of non-material being performing actions is incoherent. 5 and 6, therefore, the idea of God is incoherent. God can't exist. Okay, so if you caught, and we've mentioned it a couple times in the previous weeks, the question-begging fallacy, the fallacy of begging the question. That's what was going on in premise 3, okay? So whether the only possible kinds of actions are those that are affected by material beings is precisely where the theist and atheist disagree. You can't assume it in one of your premises and expect the theist not to say, hold on there, that's the whole argument. Let's have that argument, not assume it up front. And we see this in most atheism. Even the famous parable of the invisible gardener, which the book that I had, and it's in tons of different books, and I didn't even bring the one. But basically the idea is you have these two philosophers, an atheist philosopher, Anthony Flew, who, by the way, changed his mind right before his death. He didn't become a Christian, but he became a theist on the basis of several things. Don't worry about that. But he was kind of the standard bearer after Bertrand Russell died in the late 20th century of the big British atheist. But Anthony Flew came up with this parable called The Invisible Gardener. He's a theist and an atheist, obviously, as the two characters in the story. And the atheist wanted to say, well, let's test this. You say that there's this gardener that cares for his garden and comes every night or every morning to take care of it and so forth. Let's put some electric fence up and see if there is any signs, any evidence of him coming. And he does this the first time, and then the theist person who believes in the invisible gardener says, well, yes, but he's a super sensible gardener, and therefore he wouldn't leave any evidence. And this goes on for a couple of exchanges, and then finally the atheist guy basically says, well, then what's the difference between your invisible gardener and one who is not a being at all? Now, what's happening is the same thing. But again, because there's a parable and a story, and you're getting into the characters and who represents who, and it's very physical and tangible, you forget, wait a minute, he's doing the same thing all atheist arguments do. He's assuming a certain attribute of God exists and saying that that thing, if it existed, would do such and such, in this case, leave a mark on my electric fence, or in the bushes or something if he got around or say, ow, or something like that when he's zapped. In other words, you're assuming up front that the only effects in the material world are created by material efficient causes or embodied beings. But that begs the question. You haven't made your case by assuming it up front. Okay, let's fast forward. And I'm going to do these middle 2 points really quickly because we have time constraints here. Atheism as a totalizing circular argument. I already gave you a hint of it with that fallacy of begging the question. But I put this chart up, and I apologize for the size, but now that you guys have your notes, it shouldn't be too much of a problem. I also apologize for the busyness of it, so I had to label each of the 3 arguments A, B, and C so that you can follow the circle. And in this argument, you have nature is all there is, science studies nature. Well, if that's true and that's true, then supernature has to be unscientific, because if all nature does is, if all science does is study nature, okay, but you've assumed up front that nature is all there is. But if science studies only nature, perhaps then it has nothing to say about supernatural causation, or at least in any obvious way. But see, you're assuming that up front. So the circular argument, or the fallacy of circular reason, is very closely associated and really often the same thing as the fallacy of begging the question, because you're assuming in your premise that which you are supposed to prove, that which is your conclusion, okay? But again, if you state it in a way that couches it, or, in popular language, it's easier to get away with, or easier not to see yourself. There's other forms that this takes. Supernatural things, what's that? That's incoherent. And so on. You get the idea. So this takes various forms. One atheist philosopher, D.Z. Phillips, he proposed that it makes no sense to think about what is beyond the world. Well, is he saying that they're square circles, or is he saying that's just beyond our strongest telescopes? I mean, what is he saying? The other guy, Nielsen, I already mentioned, he challenges the coherence of God language, any language that's transcendent to the universe or beyond the universe. He asks, how would that be other than just more universe? What's he doing? He's thinking of our claims as claims about spatial realities. This is like third grade level atheism here. But it happens. Richard Dawkins most recently challenges the credentials of theism on the dilemma that, well, it's either scientific or else it's not scientific. If it's scientific, it's failed science's tests. If it's not scientific, well, then it's utterly make-believe. And one of the ways that people would say this, do I have this up there, the God of the Gaps? Is that one of the ones I have? Yeah, I do. In C, pre-scientific data or claims about causation were what they called God of the Gaps explanations. In other words, they were things that we didn't have an explanation for, but we now know. I always mark people that talk like that. We now know such and such. The idea there is that we had this gap in our explanations, and the older people would all just put God there. God was their explanation for that which we didn't understand, like lightning and thunder. God is mad, but we now know that there's atmospheric. Did the Christian theist actually believe it in that way, and did they propose it as a scientific theory? So these are the kind of questions you have to ask. But if you put it in popular language, you can kind of cover over the form of the argument, which is fundamentally the same. What about atheism as a totalizing religious commitment? Well, let me start with this statement by Norman Geisler, because one of the things atheists do to get away from these kind of the things I'm bringing up in these middle sections to say, look, we're not even a worldview. We're certainly not a religion. We're not committed. We're theists. We're just asking questions, man. So they kind of do what agnostics do, but they will go all the way and deny God's existence. And it's the way that they can kind of put atheism out there, even if it doesn't prove itself, as the only rational game in town, because it at least is not stopping to ask questions. If you're religious, you have to stop asking questions. You have these commitments, and you can't press further and follow the evidence where it leads. So they come up with models of atheism to avoid the religious and totalizing components of it. So Geisler says, traditional atheists who believe that there never was, is, or will be a God, Jean-Paul Sartre is an example. Then there is the mythological atheist. He's going to give you 4 different kinds. Mythological atheists like Nietzsche, who believe that the God myth was once alive, that is, it was a model men believe and live by, but that myth has died and is no longer workable. What did that just cover up, that distinction? Covered up the fact that he's an atheist just like the first dude. If I say, well, I'm not an atheist of a traditional kind, I believe that the God idea had something going for it for a while. Okay, that's just another way to say that God never existed, but it was a mythology. Okay, but with that kind of language, you can kind of soften Christians up, butter them up a little bit for a period of time, and bring your atheism in. Third one, some years ago, Thomas Althusser popularized another form of atheism, which may be called dialectical atheism. This view affirms the paradox that God was once really alive, but that he died in the incarnation and crucifixion of Christ, and that it has taken until modern times to realize that this is so. It's just another variation on what Nietzsche was talking about. Finally, there's what may be called semantical or linguistic atheism. This is essentially, we've talked about it with, remember last week, acognosticism. The words don't make sense. Well, they're just all forms of agnosticism that are trying to get around the totalizing commitment that they're asking of people. Now, this is that staircase that I introduce a lot of times to show that some fundamental idea implies other ideas. So I have atheism at the top, leading to secularism, leading to ideology, leading to scientism, but there is overlap here. Some of these words don't seem to be in the same genus, you might be thinking. But what we're showing is that atheism implies that this time and this place is the only thing worth talking about. Saeculum in the Latin is one of 2 words for world, mundus being the other. So mundane things are just earthy things. Common word for this place. Whereas saeculum is this time and place, or this age. Think of your dollar bills, Novo Orderum Orbis Seclorum, new order for the ages. That's the other word for world, but it's time and place related. So secularism would be the idea that there's nothing worth talking about. This is where the show is, this time and this place. Ideology is what you get when you believe that. So a lot of people think, as I said a couple weeks ago, ideology is just a synonym for philosophy. No, it's not. Or ideology is just a synonym for your political view. No, it's not. Ideology flows forth from this idea that because there is no eternity or any form of immortality that is literal or worth talking about, this time and this place is our only shot. And so if you're in the way of that, this explains the violent tendency of atheism applied to the civic order. It has nothing else to shoot for. So even if atheists reject the idea that man is a religious animal, they'll say, well, that's just some evolutionary glitch. That'll work itself out eventually. And we've been waiting for a long time for that to work itself out. But they'll at least admit that man is a political animal. He's a social being. They'll have explanations for all that. But all of them ignore the existential consequences of cutting yourself off from eternity. So we're not at home in the temporal. Things are not as they're supposed to be. The atheist keeps showing up to debates. He must think that there's meaning and that it matters. So ideology is inevitable for the atheist, precisely because even these basic human needs that you can pretend are not religious, what are those needs? Permanence, purpose, justice, some common good, they're reduced to this time and this place. They have to be found in this life, and they have to be delivered by some class or some group of masters of the discovery of these new truths. And so atheism therefore goes hand in hand with scientism. This is the pretended discovery department of secularism. Science becomes politicized. Science becomes a function of ideology. This is the way in which atheists annex science as their own and begin to talk about it like he's a guy they know. Science said this today. The science has decided, like it's the Pope. It's not just a private wish fulfillment of the atheist, it is a public wish fulfillment. So both atheism and science, capital S, trademark, the science, are the inevitable consequences of following the evidence wherever it leads. That's their view. And so when we speak about a method of science, in their view, the method of atheism is very closely associated with that. It's atheos. It's not dogmatic. Religion is dogmatic. Religion can't ask questions. But atheism is a dispassionate suspension of belief. This is where the fact versus truth distinction comes from, if you ever hear that. Well, there's no truth, but there's facts. This is where the, maybe less obvious, the public versus private religious distinction comes in. Because a public square that is free from religiously grounded principles is more scientific. Because it relies on things that we all have in common. We can all see that. We all have that in common together, instead of religions which are divisive, that rely on things that people need private revelations for and so forth, things that can't be tested. So that's sort of the grand narrative. So along these lines, I mentioned this guy Phillips, one atheist. He criticizes theism as one obvious version of a theory of everything. But he insists that there's no such thing, even though atheism is a theory of everything. He says to speak of a thing, like science and atheism does, is to acknowledge the existence of many things. But science is concerned with specific states of affairs, no matter how wide the scope of its questions may be. Whatever explanations it offers, further questions can be asked about them. In other words, the atheist is saying, we're the guys that are calm, rationally looking at things and open to more evidence and things coming in tomorrow. We're not trying to give you a theory of everything. Now, when all else fails, the objection will turn to this. This is more on a pop level, and maybe you'll recognize this. The atheist doesn't have a burden of proof, because our position is not belief like yours is. Ours is disbelief. So you're the ones with the burden of proof. But that is special pleading. It's another fallacy. Special pleading when the rules apply to, rules for thee, not me. Me for thee, yeah, that. So they're imposing that rule on you, but it doesn't apply to them. But that's a cop-out. That's a way to avoid argumentation and demonstration. All sides have a burden of proof to show the coherence of their beliefs, or they shouldn't pretend that they're rational and that they correspond to the world. So both the logic and the evidence matches up and so forth. Real quickly, let's talk about modern atheism, the particular form that it takes, usually. And it's more of a critical deconstruction. We use that word a lot now in a different way. So-and-so is deconstructing in their faith. But the deconstruction that I'm going to talk about is actually what leads up to that. Here we have a scale. We have a world on one side and a brain on the other. And the old way of talking about reality is to talk about reality. Is to actually point outside of our minds and break out rulers and calculators or books or trustworthy sources, and we would measure views by reality, like whether or not they conform. I'm going to show you this is true or false on the basis of some criteria that we can all understand. The newer way, and this is really after Kant especially, in the 19th, 20th century and beyond, is now to show what's wrong with your brain. How can you think that? You just think that because you are a capitalist, or because you are a woman, or because you were abused when you were younger, or because your pastor told you that, or because you've never stepped outside of the confines of these little 20-mile radius or whatever else, and you only hang out with people of your own kind. Where does this come from? Well, one Christian philosopher, Alvin Plantinga, gave us a helpful breakdown, or at least he talks about it a lot. The difference between what he calls a de facto objection and a de jure objection. And this one, as the name suggests, is an objection on the basis of fact. In other words, you ought to reject this view because it fails to conform to reality, and here I am to show you how that is the case. It's very objective in that sense. But then what happened after Kant especially, and four famous cases of philosophers in the 19th century, is that we started to deconstruct. No longer should you not believe that because it's false, but the reason you should reject it is because the idea came to form in your mind by some suspicious set of circumstances, something I'm going to throw some shade on right now. And sometimes these thinkers were called masters of suspicion. I'm referring to Ludwig Feuerbach, Karl Marx, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Sigmund Freud. But they were just the most famous examples who dealt with religion, not on the basis of it being false according to objective standards, but on the basis of how it was formed in people's mind. Whether the treatment was psychological, Freud, sociological, Marx, sort of a history of religion's evolutionary approach with Feuerbach, and then Nietzsche, sort of a spattering of both, but very highly political in that sense. And so I have flowing from here to what causes it in the mind, and therefore you should reject it. It's color-coded. I like to make it simple. Feuerbach is basically saying that the divine nature is really just a projection of certain attributes that we have in our own minds of human nature. He develops that out in history and then tries to show it with the mind. I think he winds up contradicting himself. And this is in a book called The Essence of Christianity in 1841. And Freud, his ideas were not new, at least at this point, because the projection part of it was already said by Feuerbach. In the case of Marx, religion is the opiate to the masses. So in other words, this is the thing that the ruling classes, and of course religion is just there with law and with family and with social custom and a bunch of other things that together make up what he called a false consciousness. And the idea is that the bourgeoisie, those that own the means of production, foisted this upon the working classes in society so they would not have class consciousness. They would not be aware of their place and how they were being oppressed and so forth. And instead, these various institutions and ideas like law is just the mechanism of oppression. Marriage is just middle-class prostitution, pretty much. Religion, when he says it's the opiate to the masses, think of the doctrine of divine providence and how that's one of its uses is to make us content with what God has given us. Now think about that structure in Marxism, looking at that and saying, aha, this is just the bourgeoisie, through the agency of their priesthood, patting people on the head and saying, there. Be content, don't covet, etc., etc., etc. And it anesthetizes us, I guess, against suffering in this world and doing justice and so forth. Okay? For Nietzsche, it's a very different thing. I got a slide for him. For Nietzsche, in his mind, Christians were preachers of death. And what did he mean by that? He mean that Western civilization is going down the tubes. And the reason is because we've embraced weakness, we've embraced death. By the way, Ayn Rand would pick up on this in the 20th century. For her, the idea that the bad guy was altruism, the idea of giving up yourself, but for Nietzsche it was giving up all the way in death. Where did this come from? Morality, I'll come back to this. He writes 2 books in 2 straight years. The idea there's a weaker class that had caged and suppressed the will and suppressed greatness and made us think that it's moral just to drop dead, basically, to give of ourselves and so forth. Well, how'd that happen? Well, in the ancient world, you had masters and slaves. And of course, the majority of people are going to be slaves. Morality comes from essentially the Jews, and then the Christians made it even worse with Christ and self-sacrifice and everything like that. But you had slave morality and master morality. Master morality, its virtue was greatness, but for the slaves it was justice, or being oppressed, right? The stratification, what stratifies them in society, one is a hierarchy, one is equality. The means of it is conquest for the masters, self-sacrifice for the slaves. And then the antithesis here is what is useful versus what is useless, good versus evil, the genealogy of morals. That came in the ancient world, the priestly class of the Jews under Egyptian rule, Christians under Roman rule, to avenge their weakness by a new narrative which becomes pessimism. Nietzsche was calling us to a different narrative which is called nihilism. And that had to work itself out and stuff like that. But the warrior versus the priest. I almost want to ask Nietzsche, how did the warriors were so great, how did they become suppressed and mastered by these weaklings? Anyway, that's another story. Now for Freud, I'll just end with this. For Freud, there was two different things going on that led to the idea of God. Fast forward a little bit. Two natural origins of religion. First of all, there was an evolutionary development from our view toward our fathers. So females belonged to the dominant male. So the male offspring came together and united to overwhelm him, kill him, devour him. So on the one hand, the father was the enemy, but on the other hand, he was the ideal. And so they projected this wish fulfillment to restore their father in the sky, this universalized idea. Freud had other weird ideas too. One of them was just simply fear. So this is a little bit more borrowing from Feuerbach, but the idea of fear. And this is not, this is something we witness in polytheism. So as part of the whole history of religion schools, you start with animism, polytheism. Where's that come from? Well, there's these forces of nature that we can't control. So we attribute different higher powers to them, and eventually we consolidate that into one being. Okay? So that was the idea in the 19th century. What is the problem with all of these that they all have in common? There's another fallacy I've not introduced yet, and it's called the genetic fallacy. And the genetic fallacy is that you should disbelieve this, whatever it is, a proposition or a whole theory. You should reject this. Why? Because of its source. Now, there's a specific kind of this that you've probably heard of called the ad hominem attack. What are you going to believe that guy for? Matt, come on. Matt's, he's a sinner for one. And he's got all these other problems. So that's an ad hominem attack. You shouldn't, but actually the ad hominem attack, and that just means to the man, is actually a species of the genetic fallacy. You should reject this view no longer because it doesn't conform to the real world, and I've got some rulers and calculators and authoritative sources and our reason. We're just going to think through this, think about which one actually matches up to the world. And all I'm doing here is psychologically explaining away. I'm deconstructing. It's sort of this titillation you get when you're the first person in your block to tell the other kids that Santa Claus isn't real, or to deliver some bad news or something like that. There's a kind of personality that gets caught up in that becomes for him a substitute for reason, as if he's done his tough-minded work. But this is what happened in the 19th century. Natural theology or arguments for God's existence were already seen to be discredited, and so they didn't have to do the hard work of reasoning into Christian civilization anymore. They simply were telling people what they wanted to hear, and yet something, and this is one of the criticisms Nietzsche had, he said Christians are so hypocritical and Western civilization is so hypocritical because they don't actually believe in this anymore, but they want to retain its morality. So, these are masters of suspicion, and the basic problem they're giving us is that you only believe this because this train of things happened. And as one Christian author states about this. The essence of this argument is that since belief in God can be understood as a human invention, we can conclude that this God is nothing more than a fantasy. And you can actually put a sharper point on it. Because this belief in God is motivated by X, Y, and Z psychological thing, you need this to be true. You have a fear, you have a sin problem, you know you're going to die eventually, and because those things, therefore, it is reducible to that. R.C. Sproul wrote a really good book that you should read if you've ever been caught on that idea. It was originally called The Psychology of Atheism, but they made him change the title for mass consumption, I guess. It's called If There Is a God, Why Are There Atheists? And he deals with these arguments, but then he turns the coin over on them, and he says, well, let's look, instead of Freud's repression, let's look at Paul's suppression in Romans 1:18. Fact is, both the atheist and the theist have all kinds of psychological reasons for believing what they do. You can't rid yourself of psychological reasons and motives. Here's the problem. That doesn't get an inch off the ground in telling us what view is most likely to be true. Psychological explanations are neat, they're fun, they may even be interesting, they may actually be important for something else, but they don't help us in the least in deciding which view. You're just describing what's going on in my brain. I'm going to describe what's going on in your brain. You believe that, you came to believe that because you were at Christian camp, and you came to believe that because you hung out with only atheists in a communist nation and so on. Okay, we can all do that to each other all day. But that doesn't help us at all get outside of our minds and actually say, okay, now on the basis of logic and evidence, which view is more likely to be true? Okay, so that's the criticism there. And as I said, we don't have time for Q&A because of all the tech problems this morning. Unless somebody wants to get a buzzer beater in. Anybody want a buzzer beater? One buzzer beater. Yes, in the back.
Could you explain the psychological effects on the various denominationals?
Sorry, maybe to reframe that a little bit, psychological effects of it.
It spurred me to think that there has to be a connection between this human psychological determinism and the various number of denominations in Christendom.
Oh, sure. Okay. You can explain that in a couple different ways. One is the easiest is just go back in church history and see the threads where they came from. But your question is the cause in here, and that is a good example of where that is interesting and maybe helpful analysis. You could argue that different psychological types, whether you determine that by Myers-Briggs or something else, different psychological types tend to become more Presbyterian or more Baptist or more Methodist or whatever. I think there's something to that, but you can't make it, and a lot of that has to do with how much thinking or how much background in reading you have, maybe what your cultural background is. So there's definitely something to it. There's other sociological aspects too. It's a legitimate question, but it'd be a difficult one to answer in a way that doesn't offend a whole bunch of groups. But it's pretty well known that I've even heard Baptists jokingly, self-deprecatingly say, well, the Presbyterians are the ones who think about these things versus anyway. So, but people get a bad rap for that. So I'll yeah, right. And they can come right back and say, well, there's some sociological and maybe psychological things too. You guys are the guys that like to control your environment a little too much, or simply don't know how to dance. I don't know. Or you're not very emotive. Okay, I won't get into that. But that's good. Let me pray. Father, we thank you for this time, and we pray that you will continue to use this class to sharpen our minds, to make us see more of the all-comprehensiveness of the truth of the Christian faith. We pray for your blessing on all that we do today. We pray it